How's everyone who's watching this? This is my 43rd video on the channel, and today we're looking at Sigmund Freud's 1917 essay, Mourning and Melancholia. In the paper, Freud outlines two specific ways that individuals deal with loss. The one healthy, the other pathological. I'm quite excited for this episode as it's here that we'll set the groundwork for the next concept-based video, which will be on Judith Butler's notion of melancholic gender. Now, before we get into it, some quick definitions for those not familiar with Freud would probably be quite helpful. To begin with, objects refer to things that individuals direct desire towards, usually being people or parts of people. Moving on, cathexis refers to the investment of desire into either said objects or the ego, the psychoanalytic self. Lastly, libido is a kind of psychical energy tied to that desire, used by Freud in a separate sense than usual in English. With these definitions in mind, Freud begins the work with a disclaimer. Melancholia is a puzzling disease, to say the least. In his time, it referred to an incredibly broad range of conditions, whose unity was difficult to prove. As such, Freud says that he'll focus only on cases where the cause is undeniably solely psychological in nature. As he states,
"We shall therefore, from the outset, drop all claims to general validity for our conclusions."
With this out of the way, Freud probably starts the essay with an analysis of the process of mourning. Defined by a painful sense of dejection and a lack of interest in the outside world, he sees it as the result of a loss of an object. For example, the death of a beloved friend or parent. In Freud's eyes, as can be seen in this diagram, the process behind it is relatively simple and occurs in four main steps. Firstly, the object is invested or cathected with libido by the subject before it's lost. It's cared about and loved by them. Next, after its loss, the subject undergoes a process of reality checking, which informs them that the object is no longer there. This leads to the ego slowly but surely untangling its cathexes. This is a process that can take a long time, since each memory, expectation, and feeling invested into the object has to be removed. Finally though, the cathexes once connected to the lost object can be redirected towards new ones. As Freud himself says, this is why, despite the great pain it can cause, mourning isn't seen as pathological.
The fact is, however, that when the work of mourning is completed, the ego becomes free and uninhibited again.
It's on this note that he shifts his attention to the other condition that adorns the paper's title, melancholia. It shares many of the same symptoms as mourning, albeit with the addition of a sense of self-loathing. Adding on, it is a pathology, since whilst the mourner can eventually detach themselves from the lost object, the melancholic remains fixated or trapped by it. Additionally, the loss it originates from doesn't necessarily have to be as dramatic or final as death. It may be that the melancholic instead became disillusioned with an ideal, or was jilted by a lover. However, the most important feature of this loss is that it's necessarily unconscious. As Freud says,
Even if the patient is aware of the loss which has given rise to his melancholia, he knows whom he has lost, but not what he has lost in him.
Moving on, Freud focuses on the most obvious symptom that separates melancholia from run-of-the-mill mourning, the severely critical attitude the melancholic holds towards themselves. To borrow Freud's words again,
In mourning, it is the world which has become poor and empty. In melancholia, it is the ego itself.
For the melancholic, their ego is reprehensible and worthy of scorn, something they don't hesitate to share with others. These self-accusations may or may not be accurate, in the sense that they align with other people's perceptions of them. However, what matters is that the melancholic sees them as true to an almost delusional degree, pointing towards a complete loss of self-respect. At this point, Freud states that we stumbled into something of a problem. How can we compare mourning with melancholia if the one involves a loss of an object whilst the other seemingly deals with a loss of the ego? His response is that melancholics actually shift accusations that could be directed towards the lost object onto their own ego. As he says,
If one listens patiently to melancholics' many and various self-accusations, one cannot in the end avoid the impression that often the most violent of them are hardly at all applicable to the patient himself, but that they do fit someone else, someone whom the patient loves or has loved or should love.
This might sound a bit bizarre at first. However, to explain the process behind it, I hope a diagram like this might help. Basically, instead of simply detaching the cathexes linked to the lost object like in mourning, the ego in melancholia withdraws them into itself, with fragments of the object still attached. This essentially produces identifications with what is lost. To paraphrase the way I saw it explained in r/psychoanalysis, think about a subject who loved someone we'll call Mrs. Yellow. After she leaves them for whatever reason, the melancholic subject doesn't just delink their libido from her and displace it onto someone else, like Mrs. Blue. Instead, they withdraw it into themselves, tinging their ego yellow in the process. To use Freud's words,
the narcissistic identification becomes a substitute for the erotic cathexis, the result of which is that in spite of conflict with the loved person, the love relationship need not be given up.
It's with this that we get to the heart of melancholia, a feeling of ambivalence directed towards what has been lost. In a word, the melancholic loves the object for what it was, but simultaneously hates it for abandoning them. It's for this reason that they have such a low self-esteem. They are expressing ambivalence towards what is now a part of themselves. In this way, both narcissism and sadism play a role in melancholia. To begin with the first, the condition essentially involves what Freud calls a regression to primary narcissism. This is because, rather than directing libido outwards towards other objects, the melancholic instead cathects to their own ego with a yellow-tinged desire. Sadism, on the other hand, enters the scene in how the condition seeks to destroy what it incorporates. This is what makes melancholia so incredibly dangerous. For Freud, the ego loves itself. It's almost impossible for it to seek its own destruction. Suicidal thoughts usually only occur in neurosis, when homicidal ones are inverted. However, to borrow his words,
the analysis of melancholia now shows that the ego can kill itself only if, owing to the return of the object cathexis, it can treat itself as an object.
Basically, suicidality is a direct result of the sadism directed towards the object that is now part of the ego. At this point, Freud takes a step back to discuss some problems that the condition poses when it comes to psychoanalysis. To begin with, it seems to disappear with time in the same way that mourning does. Unfortunately though, as Freud says,
in neither case have we any insight into the economics of the course of events.
Something we can explore though is why mania often follows from melancholia, like in the case of what would today be called the bipolar disorders. It isn't by any means a necessary part of melancholia, which presents a diverse range of symptoms, but it's still puzzling. Freud warns that his explanation will likely be unsatisfactory due to the complexities of the two's relationship, but regardless makes it his focus for the remainder of the essay. In his eyes, there are two things that can guide us: a psychoanalytic impression and an economic experience. The first concerns the fact that the content of mania seems very similar to that of melancholia. The difference seems to reside in how melancholia involves the ego succumbing to a loss, whilst mania seems to push it aside or master it. Moving on to the second, Freud sees the feeling of elation, something that characterizes experiences of mania, as the result of large sums of psychical tension being released when no longer needed. This is something that usually occurs non-pathologically.
When, for instance, some poor devil, by winning a large sum of money, is suddenly relieved from chronic worry about his daily bread, or when a long and arduous struggle is finally crowned with success.
However, in mania, this elation occurs even when an actual need isn't gone, hence why it's seen as a disorder. The subject doesn't act as if they're in high spirits or uninhibited because they're naturally cheerful, but rather their manic state takes hold because their ego has triumphed over something unconscious. Using these two impressions, Freud says we can supply a provisional explanation for why melancholia and mania go hand in hand.
The ego must have gotten over the loss of the object, and the whole quota of anticathexis, which the painful suffering of melancholia had drawn to itself from the ego, will have become available.
To explain, anticathexis refers to the use of libido to block what is unpleasurable from entering consciousness. Essentially, the melancholic ego tries to stop the pain caused by the loss of an object by investing large amounts of energy into barricading itself. When that finally becomes unnecessary, a large amount of libido becomes available for release, hence mania. However, Freud says that, whilst this might sound plausible, it's still deficient in a number of ways. Namely, he sees it as too indefinite and the cause of even more problems. For example, mania usually doesn't occur after mourning has run its course. There isn't the same sum of energy released, even though mourning also involves libido becoming unbound to the lost object. Freud reasons that this might be because of a very gradual nature of mourning's decathexis, where each individual attachment has to go through the process of reality checking. As he says,
"We may perhaps suppose that this work of severance is so slow and gradual that by the time it has been finished, the expenditure of energy necessary for it is also dissipated."
At this point, Freud takes a step back to say that so far we haven't explored the topographical side of melancholia's operation. That's to say, we haven't seen how it interacts with the different zones of the psyche, outside of stating that it's unconscious. Its relationship to consciousness and the preconscious is still up in the air. To guide us, he offers a question. What part of the melancholic process is involved with the object cathexes themselves? What part is instead connected to the identifications embedded into the ego? His quick and easy answer is that
the unconscious thing presentation of the object has been abandoned by the libido.
In other words, melancholia does in fact involve a withdrawal of cathexes, like in mourning, although as we saw earlier, it isn't exactly as clean. The presentation of the object, its existence in the unconscious, is composed of uncountable memories, feelings, and what have you, thus requiring a long, drawn-out process. This all should sound a bit familiar to mourning, but where they differ is in their topography. Essentially, the effects of withdrawal in mourning can pass directly into consciousness through the preconscious. However, for some reason, the same can't be said about melancholia. To explain why this is true that Freud reminds us about ambivalence. Thousands of struggles are fought upon the object during the unconscious portion of the melancholic process. Hate stemming from being abandoned assaults the libido's cathexes, whilst love struggles to help them weather the storm. This ambivalence, when it doesn't directly stem from the events surrounding the loss itself, is, more often than not, constitutional. What this means is that it makes up a part of every love relationship formed by that specific ego. There's always an underlying conflict. Why this matters topographically is that it explains why ambivalence remains caught in the unconscious system. Essentially, for something to be constitutional for Freud, it has to be the result of some kind of trauma and thus repressed elements. Melancholic ambivalence therefore can't be allowed to escape the system, since to do so would threaten everything. It's only after this process that melancholia can become conscious. Its end, as Freud rather eloquently puts it,
consists in the threatened libidinal cathexis at length, abandoning the object, only to draw back to the place in the ego from which it had come. So by taking flight into the ego, love escapes extinction.
The conscious side of melancholia surfaces, as we've seen again and again, in the form of the ego debasing and raging against itself. To borrow Freud's words, at the end of the day, this is essentially useless to explore when it comes to trying to help the patient. What brings it to an end is necessarily something unconscious, which he describes by again drawing a parallel between mourning and melancholia. Basically, just like reality checking allows the ego to move on from its loss in the first, hate in the second plays the role of loosening the subject's fixation on the object. As he says, there are thus two ways it can conclude.
Either after the fury has spent itself, or after the object has been abandoned as valueless. We cannot tell which of these two possibilities is the regular or more usual one.
Now, to end the essay, Freud sums up what he's been discussing thus far. At the end of the day, melancholia is fundamentally a narcissistic condition. It is characterized by the way in which object cathexes are turned into identifications. It's through this feature that Freud says we can explain mania. By transforming the struggle over the object into a conflict in the ego, melancholia essentially frees up libido that is then experienced as elation. It's with this that he concludes, warning that all of this is only to be taken as a provisional explanation, one that is likely insufficient in numerous ways. It's on this rather bittersweet note that we finish our video on Sigmund Freud's 1917 essay Mourning and Melancholia, understanding the processes at play behind the two. I truly hope you enjoyed or learned something, and if you feel I got anything wrong or wasn't as clear as I could have been, please do feel free to let me know in the comments so I can do better. Next time, we'll be finishing off The Three Ecologies by Felix Guattari. Until then, bye!